because as far as I could see, I was going to be incapacitated for the rest of my life, and it was going to really basically crush the dreams that I'd had. God was the most constant and the most consistent thing in my life. Hi, my name is Emmy. I have been a member of Christ Church now for nearly 8 years. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about a period of my life in which was really difficult, and how God saw me through it, and how my relationship with Him was a real anchor in that time. So back in 2017, October, I was diagnosed with a condition called epilepsy. I had my first seizure while I was at a friend's house. And then for the next kind of couple of years after that, and after the diagnosis, things were really tough, and it was a real kind of carpet being pulled from underneath my feet moment. I went from being very healthy and being able to do day-to-day life well, to suddenly being really incapacitated by this condition. And for those who don't know what epilepsy is, it's a condition that causes you to have quite severe convulsions or seizures. And so, yeah, like I said, I went from a time of being very well, both physically and mentally, to suddenly being very unwell. And it was a very frightening time because epilepsy makes you basically lose control of your body. And I spent a long time living in fear of what, we're meant to celebrate our bodies, but I was living in fear of what my body, or my brain in particular, was going to do. And so it was a period of time where I spent a lot of time just anxious and concerned that I was going to have a seizure, because it's scary, and it was very scary for the people who knew me at the time, and they're very unpredictable, and I didn't know when it was going to happen, and physically and mentally and emotionally it was an extremely draining time, and we didn't really know whether it was ever going to get under control. And so I spent a lot of time in hospital, and I spent a lot of time off work, because I just simply couldn't really function from day to day, because of how physically unwell I was. And it was a really difficult time, and everything changed almost overnight, from going from being very independent and being able to do a lot of things on my own, to suddenly losing all of that, and not being able to drive, not really being able to trust my body to get me through the day. I had seizures at night, so I spent a lot of time not really sleeping because I was scared to go to sleep. And it was a frightening time for my friends and family too, because they saw me going from being a very healthy person to being very, very unwell very quickly. And it was a time where I really did genuinely question my faith. I had kind of hit a point in my life up to that point where things were going really well, and I was feeling really positive about the future. And I was looking forward to traveling, and I was looking forward to going abroad more, and I was looking forward to kind of taking more of a career trajectory towards being a paramedic. But literally overnight that all changed. And so I did question my faith, and I questioned where was God in this moment. And it was during this time that I really discovered actually what it was to be angry at God, but also to trust Him as well, and kind of have balanced those things up. And so I went through a period of time of just praying out loudly, vocally at night on my own, being very, very, very angry at God, and not really understanding where His plans were in this, because as far as I could see, I was going to be incapacitated for the rest of my life, and it was going to really basically crush the dreams that I'd had for my future, including things like having a job in being a paramedic, and also things like having children, which was now questioned because of the condition. But actually I spent a long time questioning, but I also found that I really heard from God, probably the most I've ever heard from God during this time in my life, because I was so clung to Him, and I was so desperately looking for answers, that actually I was really opening my heart to Him without even realising. As far as I was aware, I was closing myself off to God, but actually what I was doing, I was communicating with God more than I ever had done in my life. And what I felt and found was that actually during those difficult times, that God was the most constant and the most consistent thing in my life. Like, God doesn't change ever, and he hadn't changed in that moment. From the moment I had my epilepsy, it wasn't God taking a step back from my life, and it wasn't God sort of shaking me off or punishing me or anything like that. It was an opportunity for me to seek God even more. And I think sometimes we have a tendency to draw away from God when things are difficult, and I know that I've done that in the past. But actually, what I really felt encouraged by the people around me in particular was to draw closer to God in this time. And so I prayed, and I spent time just on my own, and I focused on myself, and I just focused on my relationship with God. And actually, sometimes when I look back on it, I realise how much I changed as a person, not just physically because of the epilepsy, but also with my walk of faith. I realise now that actually, when everything else is stripped away, when I no longer have control over my body, and I have no longer got control over what might happen in that day, that actually when it all is stripped away, God is still there. Like, he hasn't changed, he hasn't turned his back on me. And actually, I think while everything else in my life was so chaotic and unpredictable, I took joy in knowing that actually God was constant and was there. And the psalm in particular that I really drew to a lot during this time was Psalm 18, which I'd read a lot when I was younger, but actually I really lent into this psalm in particular, and these verses in particular stood out to me. And it's in Psalm 18 verses 16. He sent me on high, he took me, he drew me out of many waters. He rescued me from my strong enemy and from those who hated me, for they were too mighty for me. They confronted me in my day of calamity, but the Lord was my support. He brought me out into a broad place. He rescued me because he delights in me. And that psalm was written by David after he'd basically won all these victories, and he was basically celebrating with God, saying, Lord, you're a God of promises, and I know that I had to get up and go and, pick up my sword and go to battle, but you were 100% part of that victory, and you had your hand in that. And because of the promises you laid out before me, David was celebrating those victories with God. And I felt really challenged, actually, that when things are difficult, it's really easy to sit and expect God to lay out the answers to you. And when he doesn't answer your prayers straight away, you immediately presume that he hasn't either heard them or he's not bothered. But sometimes God doesn't answer our prayers how we expect them to be answered. And, we are very much not a passive part of this. Like, when he hears our prayers, are we getting up and are we getting going? And I felt really challenged by that and realised that actually I can pray all these prayers to God, but am I getting up and being a part of that relationship? Am I getting up and being a part of what God has planned for me? And it took me a long time, didn't happen overnight, but it took me a long time to realise eventually that the epilepsy was a new part of my life. And as much as my medication is amazing and has changed my life and has helped me to function day to day, I'm still aware that it's there, but I've learned that actually God is calling me to get up and get going. And while things are difficult at times, looking at this particular psalm and how David knew that despite the fact that he had gone out and he had won these victories with his sword, that actually it was God who he should be celebrating with, because God keeps his promises. And I know that God has a plan for me, and though that has changed significantly since 2017, these plans he has for me are no lesser important. And I trust that he will lead my ways, and that I will just continue to cling to him, because he is the one constant thing in my life.